I'd like everyone to meet the woman who'll be taking care of me in the next chapter of my life," my husband announced during our 40th anniversary party, his hand resting proudly on the waist of a woman young enough to be our daughter. The ballroom went silent so quickly I could hear the soft clink of my champagne glass trembling against my wedding ring. I'm Evelyn Whitmore, 68 years old, and until that moment, I believed I knew exactly who my husband was. I had spent 6 months planning that anniversary celebration at the Grand Bellevue Hotel in downtown Charleston. Every flower arrangement had been chosen personally by me. White roses for loyalty, gold candles for endurance. A jazz quartet playing the same songs Charles and I danced to when we were young and struggling to pay rent in our first tiny apartment outside Savannah. I even wore the navy blue satin dress he once told me made me look elegant in a timeless way. That morning, while standing in front of the bathroom mirror curling my silver hair carefully, I remember smiling at my reflection because I truly thought the night would be one of the happiest evenings of our lives. 40 years of marriage felt sacred to me. In my mind, surviving decades together meant something. It meant commitment, history, loyalty. The ballroom had looked beautiful when guests began arriving just after 6 o'clock. Crystal chandeliers glowed softly against ivory walls while servers carried trays of champagne and crab cakes through the crowd. Friends hugged us warmly. Former business partners shook Charles's hand. Our son Daniel arrived with his wife Claire, carrying the framed photograph collage I had made for the entrance display. Everyone kept complimenting the decorations, but looking back now, I realized something felt strange long before Charles took that microphone. People avoided holding eye contact with me for too long. Conversations stopped when I approached. A few women gave me sad smiles I couldn't understand at the time. I thought maybe I was imagining things. Age has a way of making you second-guess your instincts. Around 7:30, Charles disappeared for nearly 20 minutes. I assumed he was speaking with the hotel manager or taking one of his endless business calls. That was normal for him. Charles Whitmore always believed the world should pause when he entered a room. When he finally returned, he walked through the ballroom doors beside a tall blonde woman wearing a fitted cream-colored dress and diamond earrings that reflected the chandelier light like tiny stars. She couldn't have been older than 42. At first, I thought she was someone's guest who had arrived late. Then I noticed the way Charles looked at her. Proud, protective, excited. My stomach tightened so suddenly I nearly dropped my glass. The jazz music faded as Charles climbed onto the small stage near the dance floor and tapped his fork gently against a champagne flute. "Can I have everyone's attention?" he asked with a smile so relaxed it frightened me. Guests slowly turned toward him. I stood near the center of the ballroom, still holding the speech cards I had prepared for my own toast. Charles wrapped one arm around the blonde woman beside him and cleared his throat. 40 years is a long journey, he began. A few polite laughs rippled through the room. And sometimes life surprises you with new beginnings when you least expect them. I remember blinking in confusion. My heart started pounding harder with every word. Then he said the sentence that split my life cleanly in half. "I'd like everyone to meet Sophia Bennett, the woman who'll be taking care of me in the next chapter of my life." No one moved. No one breathed. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a fork slipped onto a plate with a sharp metallic sound. I stared at my husband while heat rushed into my face so fast I thought I might faint. But what hurt more than his words was the expression on several faces around me. They already knew. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. Claire looked horrified. One of Charles's business partners slowly turned away toward the bar as if he couldn't bear to witness what was happening. My own son couldn't even look at me. Sophia gave a small, nervous smile and touched Charles's arm gently like she belonged there beside him. Like I was the outsider. Charles looked directly at me. Then, waiting for a reaction. Maybe he expected tears. Maybe anger. Maybe a dramatic scene he could later describe as proof that I was unstable or bitter or emotional with age. Instead, I smiled softly and placed my champagne glass down on the nearest table before it slipped from my shaking fingers. Because in that terrible moment, standing beneath those golden chandeliers surrounded by people who pitied me, I suddenly realized something even more painful than my husband's betrayal. I was the only person in that ballroom who hadn't known my marriage was already over. For a few endless seconds, nobody in the ballroom seemed to know where to look. Some guests stared down into their champagne glasses while others pretended to adjust napkins or check their phones. The jazz quartet stopped playing completely, leaving only the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant clatter of dishes from the hotel kitchen. I stood perfectly still near the center table, feeling as though the entire room had suddenly moved miles away from me. Charles remained on stage beside Sophia with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he had already won. What shocked me most was not his cruelty. It was how rehearsed everything felt. The speech, the timing, the careful placement of humiliation in front of 200 invited guests. My eyes slowly moved across the ballroom, searching for one familiar face that looked genuinely surprised. I could not find one. My longtime neighbor Patricia looked devastated, but not confused. Daniel kept rubbing the back of his neck the same nervous way he did as a teenager whenever he had bad report cards from me. Even the hotel event manager avoided looking directly at me. That was when I realized this was not some impulsive emotional mistake. This evening had been planned carefully, down to the final detail. "Evelyn," Charles finally said into the microphone with a forced smile, "why do not you come join us up here? Join us." As though I were being invited into my own replacement ceremony. A few uncomfortable chuckles floated weakly through the room before dying almost instantly. I could feel everyone waiting for me to collapse, to scream, to cry, to become the emotional older woman they could whisper about later while driving home. Instead, I smoothed one hand gently over my dress and walked slowly toward the stage with my shoulders straight. My heels clicked softly against the marble floor while every eye followed me. I stopped beside Charles but refused to look at Sophia directly. If I looked at her too soon, I feared my composure might crack. Up close, I could smell Charles's cologne mixed with the sharp floral perfume she wore. 40 years together, and suddenly another woman's scent stood where my life used to be. Charles leaned toward me slightly, lowering his voice enough so only I could hear. "Please do not make this difficult." Difficult? I almost laughed. After publicly humiliating his wife of 4 decades, he still wanted convenience. I finally turned toward Sophia. She looked nervous now, though she tried to hide it behind a polite smile. There was something strangely rehearsed about her, too, like someone attending an important business dinner rather than standing beside a married man at his anniversary party. "It is nice to finally meet you properly," she said quietly. Properly. The words settled into my chest like ice. They had met before without me. Many times, apparently. I nodded once and answered calmly, "I wish I could say the same." Her smile faltered immediately. Behind me, I heard Claire whisper sharply to Daniel, though I could not make out the words. My son still refused to look at me. That hurt more deeply than anything Charles had done so far. I had carried Daniel for 9 months, worked double shifts during hard years so he could attend private school, sat beside hospital beds through childhood illnesses, and defended him every time Charles criticized him for being too soft-hearted. Yet tonight, he stood frozen while another woman was introduced into our marriage like a new piece of furniture. Charles cleared his throat awkwardly and raised his glass again. "Well," he announced to the room, "life moves forward." A few hesitant guests lifted their glasses out of pure discomfort rather than celebration. I looked out across the ballroom one more time and suddenly noticed something else that made my stomach tighten. At the sweetheart table near the dance floor, the hotel staff had quietly removed my place card. Beside Charles's chair now sat a freshly printed card with Sophia Bennett's name written in gold script. My seat had disappeared before I even walked into the room. The remainder of the evening unfolded like a strange performance where everyone knew their lines except me. Hotel staff resumed serving dinner with stiff, uncomfortable smiles while the jazz quartet cautiously began playing again, though softer now, as if even the musicians sensed something sacred had just been shattered inside that ballroom. I quietly stepped away from the stage before Charles could say anything else and moved toward the sweetheart table near the dance floor. My feet felt oddly numb beneath the satin heels I had spent an hour choosing that morning. When I reached the table, I stared down at the place settings illuminated by candlelight. 2 crystal champagne glasses, 2 folded linen napkins, 2 name cards written in gold script. Charles Whitmore, Sophia Bennett. My own chair had been removed entirely. Not moved, removed, as though I had already stopped existing before I even arrived. A young waitress noticed me standing there and immediately froze with panic written across her face. "I am so sorry, ma'am," she whispered quickly. "We were given updated seating instructions this afternoon." I looked at her gently because she was probably no older than 23, and clearly terrified she had done something wrong. "It is all right," I said softly. "You were only following directions." But inside, something cold had begun settling into my chest. Not rage. Rage would have felt warmer. This felt quieter, more dangerous somehow. Across the ballroom, Charles laughed at something Sophia said while resting his hand lightly against the middle of her back. The intimacy of the gesture made my stomach twist. That was the same hand that once held mine during my mother's funeral. The same hand that steadied me after Daniel was born nearly 6 weeks early during a thunderstorm in August. Watching him now felt like watching a stranger were my husband's face. Several guests approached me carefully over the next hour, each one behaving as though they were stepping around broken glass. Patricia squeezed my arm and whispered, "You do not deserve this." Another woman avoided mentioning the situation entirely and instead complimented the floral arrangements with desperate enthusiasm. No one knew what to say because there are no proper social rules for witnessing a woman being quietly replaced in public by her own husband. Around 9 o'clock, dinner was served. I was seated at a distant side table beside 2 elderly cousins from North Carolina and one of Charles's retired law partners who looked deeply embarrassed to be there. Every few minutes, I caught people glancing toward the center table where Charles and Sophia sat together beneath the golden anniversary banner I had ordered months earlier. 40 years of love and devotion. The words now felt almost cruel. I barely touched the filet mignon placed in front of me. My appetite had disappeared completely. Halfway through dinner, I noticed Sophia leaning close to Charles while speaking softly into his ear. She laughed at something he said and adjusted his tie with casual familiarity. Then she did something small that nearly took the breath from my lungs. She reached for his wedding band and turned it gently around his finger while smiling, like she had done it before many times. Claire suddenly appeared beside my chair carrying a tray with fresh coffee cups. "Can I get you anything?" she asked too quickly. Her eyes were red around the edges as though she had been crying privately somewhere. I looked up at my daughter-in-law carefully. "Did you know?" I asked quietly. Her entire face fell apart for one brief second before she lowered her eyes toward the floor. That answer hurt more than words would have. "Evelyn," she whispered shakily. "I tried to tell Daniel this was wrong." Daniel, my own son, knew. I turned slowly toward him across the ballroom. He was standing near the bar pretending to watch a baseball game, playing silently on the television above the shelves of liquor bottles. But the moment our eyes met, he looked away instantly, like a guilty child. In that moment, I realized tonight was not simply about infidelity. It was about humiliation arranged carefully enough that my own family had chosen silence over loyalty. And somehow, sitting there beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers while strangers avoided my eyes, I understood something terrifying for the first time. Charles had not only fallen out of love with me, he had stopped respecting me long ago. I left the ballroom shortly after dessert was served. No one tried to stop me. That hurt too. 200 people had watched my marriage collapse in front of crystal chandeliers and white roses. Yet not one person stood beside me as I walked alone through the marble lobby of the Grand Bellevue Hotel. Outside, the Charleston air felt heavy with late spring humidity, wrapping around my shoulders as the valet brought my car to the entrance. I sat behind the wheel for several minutes without turning the engine on. Through the windshield, I could still see the ballroom windows glowing softly against the night. Somewhere inside, the jazz quartet was probably playing the playlist I had spent weeks choosing. The same songs Charles and I once danced to barefoot in our kitchen when we were too poor to afford real date nights. I closed my eyes and suddenly memories began rushing back with painful clarity, not because I wanted them to, but because betrayal has a cruel way of forcing old moments into new shapes. Looking back now, I could see the slow death of my marriage stretched across years like cracks spreading quietly through glass. It had not happened overnight. Charles had simply become colder one small piece at a time until I barely recognized the distance between us. 3 years earlier, he started traveling more frequently for business conferences that somehow always lasted through weekends. Then came the separate dinners because he was working late. Then the private phone calls he would take outside on the patio while lowering his voice whenever I entered the room. I remember asking him once if something was wrong between us. He barely looked up from his laptop before saying, "Not everything has to be emotional, Evelyn." At the time, I convinced myself marriage naturally changes after 40 years. Older women are taught to shrink themselves around male disappointment. We tell ourselves men become distant because of stress, aging, retirement fears, blood pressure medication, anything except the truth standing directly in front of us. I drove home slowly through downtown Charleston while those memories kept replaying in my mind. Suddenly, little details I once ignored began fitting together perfectly. The expensive silver bracelet charge I found on our credit card statement last Christmas, even though I never received jewelry. The weekends Charles claimed he was golfing with clients despite never bringing clubs home afterward. The new cologne. The gym membership after years of refusing exercise. Even the way he had started correcting my appearance in subtle ways. "You should wear brighter colors," he told me last fall while barely glancing at me over breakfast. "You look older in navy blue." Older. As if aging beside the man I devoted my entire adult life to was somehow an offense against him. By the time I pulled into our driveway, my chest felt hollow with exhaustion. The house stood dark and perfectly still beneath the oak trees lining our street. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside alone. For a moment, I simply stood in the silent foyer staring at the large framed wedding portrait hanging beside the staircase. I was 28 years old in that photograph. Charles looked proud just standing beside me. We had so little money back then that my wedding dress came from a department store clearance rack in Savannah, but I remember believing I was the luckiest woman alive. I slowly walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water with trembling hands. That was when I noticed something strange sitting near the coffee maker. A folded hotel receipt. I almost ignored it until I saw the name printed at the top. Sophia Bennett. My stomach tightened immediately. The receipt was from a luxury resort in Napa Valley dated nearly 2 years earlier. 2 years. Carefully, I unfolded the rest of the paper and saw another line beneath the room charge. Additional guest requested anniversary package with champagne and roses. Anniversary package. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table because suddenly I could not feel my legs anymore. While I had been sitting alone at home believing my husband was attending business conferences, Charles had apparently been celebrating anniversaries with another woman. And judging by the date on that receipt, the affair had already existed long before I ever suspected anything was wrong. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Charles standing beneath the ballroom lights with his arm around Sophia, while our guests stared at me with polite pity. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up trying to rest and walked downstairs wrapped in my old cashmere robe. The house felt painfully quiet without the sound of Charles moving through it. For 40 years I had complained about his habits. The heavy footsteps before sunrise. The cabinet doors left open in the kitchen. The constant clearing of his throat while reading the newspaper. But now the silence itself felt humiliating, like proof that he had emotionally left this marriage long before he physically walked out of it. I made coffee and sat alone at the kitchen island while the Napa Valley receipt remained folded beside my cup. Morning light slowly crept through the windows, turning the marble countertops pale gold. That kitchen had once been my favorite room in the house. I designed every inch of it 15 years earlier after Charles sold his second law firm partnership. Back then, he told everyone his success would not have happened without me supporting him through law school, night classes, and endless years of 70-hour work weeks. I believed we were partners. Looking back now, I realized something painful. Charles loved being admired more than he loved being loyal. Around 7:30, my phone buzzed softly against the counter. Claire. For a moment, I considered ignoring the call completely. But something inside me sensed she would not be calling unless it mattered. Good morning, I answered quietly. Claire sounded exhausted. Evelyn, are you home? Yes. There was a long pause before she spoke again. Can I come over? Alone. 20 minutes later, I watched her pull into the driveway in Daniel's silver SUV. She stepped inside carrying a leather tote bag pressed tightly against her side, like she was afraid someone might take it from her. Her eyes looked swollen from crying. I am sorry, she whispered immediately after the front door closed behind her. I am so sorry. I studied her face carefully. Claire had always been gentle by nature. Too gentle sometimes. The kind of woman who apologized when other people stepped on her foot. How long did Daniel know? I asked calmly. She lowered her gaze toward the hardwood floor. About 6 months. The words landed harder than I expected. 6 months. My son had sat across from me at Sunday dinners, hugged me on holidays, listened to me talk excitedly about planning the anniversary party, all while knowing another woman was quietly replacing me. Claire walked slowly into the kitchen and placed the leather tote bag onto the counter. "There are things you need to see," she said softly. My chest tightened instantly. She opened the bag carefully and removed several manila folders along with printed emails and copies of financial documents. At first, I could barely process what I was looking at. Hotel reservations, wire transfers, property documents. Then I saw Sophia Bennett's name connected to a luxury condominium in Miami purchased 8 months earlier through one of Charles's holding companies. My hands turned cold. He bought her a condo? Claire nodded slowly. And there is more. She slid another document toward me. This one made my stomach drop completely. Charles had recently begun transferring large amounts of money from several joint investment accounts into new corporate entities connected to Sophia. Some of the transfers were nearly $200,000 each. Daniel found out accidentally, Claire explained shakily. Your husband asked him to review paperwork for tax purposes last winter. That is how we discovered the affair. And Daniel stayed silent. Claire looked ashamed. Your husband convinced him you already knew the marriage was over. I stared down at the documents spread across my kitchen counter while sunlight continued brightening the room around us. Charles had not simply fallen in love with another woman. He had been carefully preparing a completely new life while still using the comfort, reputation, and stability of the old one I spent decades helping him build. Claire reached across the counter carefully and placed one final envelope in front of me. There is something else, she whispered. Inside was a copy of a draft trust amendment dated only 3 weeks earlier. At the bottom of the page, beneath Charles's signature, sat one sentence that made my entire body go still. Future spouse beneficiary designation, Sophia Bennett. For several long minutes, I simply sat at the kitchen counter staring at the trust amendment while Claire remained quietly across from me. Outside, sprinklers clicked softly across the neighboring lawns, and somewhere down the street a dog barked at passing delivery trucks like it was the most ordinary Tuesday morning in the world. But inside my chest, something fundamental had shifted. The grief was still there. The humiliation too. Yet beneath both emotions, another feeling had begun rising slowly to the surface. Clarity. Charles believed he had already erased me from his future. What he did not understand was that I had spent 40 years watching him build his empire piece by piece. I knew every weakness hidden beneath his confidence, every insecurity he disguised behind expensive suits and polished speeches. Most importantly, I knew exactly how careless powerful men become once they believe a woman is emotionally defeated. Claire finally broke the silence. Daniel thinks your husband is going to file for divorce within the month. I folded the trust amendment carefully and slid it back into the envelope without reacting. Did Charles write this himself? Claire nodded. Apparently, he has been working with a new estate attorney in Atlanta. Someone Sophia recommended. I almost smiled at that. Sophia recommended. Younger women often mistake access for power. They think being invited into a wealthy man's private life means they understand how his world actually functions. But Charles's world had been built long before Sophia Bennett appeared in one of his conference hotel bars, wearing fitted cream dresses and expensive perfume. I stood slowly and walked toward the large window overlooking our backyard garden. The hydrangeas were beginning to bloom near the stone pathway Charles installed for me after my 60th birthday. Back then, he told everyone I deserved beauty after standing beside him through difficult years. Looking at the garden now felt strangely peaceful. Not because I was happy, but because for the first time in months, everything finally made sense. Claire, I asked quietly, does Charles believe the Charleston house belongs entirely to him? She looked surprised by the question. I think so. Why? I turned toward her calmly. Because it does not. Her expression changed instantly. I walked back toward the kitchen island and opened the drawer beside the refrigerator where I kept old property files and insurance records. Beneath several folders sat a thin blue binder my father handed me nearly 25 years earlier after my mother passed away. Charles had never bothered reading most of the legal paperwork connected to my family trust because he always assumed those details were unimportant. In his mind, I was the sentimental wife who hosted dinner parties and remembered birthdays while he handled serious business matters. I placed the binder gently onto the counter and opened it. This house, I explained softly, was transferred into the Whitmore Family Residential Trust after my father died. Legally, Charles has residency rights through marriage, but ownership control remains connected to my bloodline. Claire stared at me in confusion. So he cannot simply take the house in a divorce? No, her eyes widened slowly. Does he know that? I gave a small shake of my head. Charles never reads documents unless money is immediately involved. He signs things quickly and assumes he already understands them. A strange calm settled over me then. For 40 years, I had allowed Charles to believe he was always the smartest person in every room. Perhaps that had been my greatest mistake. Claire looked down at the stack of financial documents spread across the counter. What are you going to do? I thought carefully before answering. The old version of me would have said something emotional, something wounded. But that woman had been left behind in the ballroom beneath those chandeliers. Nothing reckless, I replied quietly. Men like Charles expect tears. They expect anger. They prepare for emotional reactions because emotional reactions are easy to control. I closed the blue binder gently. What they never prepare for is patience. Claire stared at me for a long moment before whispering, "You are frighteningly calm." I looked past her toward the sunlight filling my kitchen, and for the first time since the anniversary party, I felt completely steady. "No," I said softly. "I am finally paying attention." At that exact moment, my phone lit up across the counter with a new incoming text message from Charles. "Hope you are feeling more reasonable this morning. Sophia and I will stop by tonight so we can discuss the next steps like adults." Charles arrived precisely at 6:30 that evening, just as he always did after business dinners or charity events where appearances mattered. Some habits survive even after loyalty dies. Through the front window, I watched his black Mercedes pull into the driveway beside Sophia's white Range Rover. For a brief moment, neither of them stepped out. I imagined they were discussing strategy inside the car, preparing themselves to deal with the emotional older wife they assumed would either beg for reconciliation or collapse into tears. Instead, I stood calmly in the kitchen arranging cheese and crackers onto a serving tray like I was expecting ordinary guests. The version of Evelyn Whitmore they believed they understood no longer existed. When the doorbell rang, I waited several seconds before opening it. Charles entered first wearing one of his tailored gray suits with that same polished confidence that once impressed judges, investors, and political donors across 3 states. Sophia followed closely behind him carrying a white orchid arrangement wrapped in expensive paper. The absurdity of it nearly made me smile. A mistress bringing sympathy flowers to the wife she publicly replaced. "Evelyn," Charles said carefully, studying my face for signs of instability. "You look well." "So do you," I replied calmly before turning toward Sophia. "Please come in." For one brief second, both of them looked genuinely confused by my composure. Good. Confused people make mistakes. Sophia extended the orchid arrangement toward me awkwardly. I thought these might brighten the house a little. I accepted the flowers with a polite smile even though my chest tightened at the sight of them. White orchids had been my favorite flowers for nearly 20 years. Charles knew that, which meant Sophia knew it too. Another intimate detail transferred from my marriage into someone else's hands. I carried the flowers into the kitchen and placed them beside the sink instead of the dining table where guests normally belonged. Small decisions matter more than people realize. We sat together in the living room shortly afterward while evening sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors in long golden lines. Charles immediately shifted into lawyer mode, folding one ankle over his knee while speaking in the calm, measured tone he used during difficult negotiations. "I know the anniversary party was not the ideal setting," he began. "Not ideal. Such careful language for public humiliation. But Sophia and I felt honesty was the best path forward." Sophia lowered her eyes modestly, like someone attending a church counseling session instead of participating in the destruction of a 40-year marriage. "We never wanted to hurt you," she added softly. I almost admired the discipline it took not to laugh. Charles continued speaking as though presenting a retirement proposal to a valued employee. He explained that he and Sophia had grown close naturally over time, that their connection was unexpected, that he still wanted us to handle everything with dignity. The entire conversation sounded rehearsed down to the punctuation marks. Then came the real purpose of the visit. About the house, Charles said carefully. There it was. Not grief. Not apology. Real estate. Sophia and I have discussed several options that would allow everyone to move forward comfortably. Everyone. As though I were included in the future he had already built without. Me. I sat quietly while he outlined plans involving luxury condominiums, retirement communities in Florida, and temporary financial arrangements designed to sound generous while quietly pushing me out of the life I helped create. At one point, Sophia even smiled sympathetically and said, "You deserve peace at this stage in life." This stage in life. Older women become invisible slowly in America. People stop speaking to us like complete human beings and start speaking to us like fragile furniture that needs relocating. Through the entire conversation, I remained calm enough that both of them visibly relaxed. Charles even poured himself bourbon halfway through the meeting, confident the situation was now under control. That was his first mistake. His second came 20 minutes later when he casually mentioned meeting with his financial advisor next week to finalize several trust updates. There are still some signatures needed, he explained while sipping his drink. Mostly procedural. Procedural. I studied him carefully over the rim of my teacup. Charles truly believed I was still the decorative wife who hosted charity luncheons while men handled meaningful decisions. He had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him. And for the first time since the ballroom humiliation, I realized something important. The more confident Charles became, the easier this would be. Over the next 2 weeks, I became someone Charles no longer recognized. I smiled politely during every phone call. I answered his messages with calm professionalism. When Daniel nervously invited me to Sunday brunch, I attended wearing pearl earrings and a cream linen blazer while discussing weather, traffic, and restaurant renovations as though our family had not just exploded beneath crystal chandeliers. My calmness unsettled everyone, especially Charles. Men who thrive on control become deeply uncomfortable when they cannot predict a woman's emotional reaction. Meanwhile, quietly and without warning anyone, I began putting my affairs in order. 3 days after Charles and Sophia visited the house, I drove to Atlanta to meet with an attorney named Rebecca Holloway, a sharp 62-year-old woman, with silver hair and the kind of focused eyes that miss absolutely nothing. Her office overlooked Peachtree Street from the 22nd floor of a glass tower downtown. I brought every document Claire had given me along with the old blue trust binder from my father. Rebecca spent nearly 2 hours reviewing paperwork silently while I sat across from her watching afternoon sunlight move slowly across the conference table. Finally, she removed her reading glasses and leaned back in her chair. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said carefully, "your husband has made a very dangerous assumption." I felt strangely calm hearing those words. Which assumption is that? He believes marital access is the same thing as ownership. She turned several documents toward me and tapped them lightly with her pen. The Charleston property, the Nantucket investment account, and the majority of the Whitmore Residential Trust are all protected under your family inheritance structure. If your husband transferred joint marital assets toward an undisclosed affair partner while concealing the relationship, there are several legal complications he clearly did not anticipate. Legal complications. Such polite words for the collapse of someone's carefully constructed future. Rebecca continued explaining financial protections, inheritance provisions, disclosure failures, and trust limitations while something inside me slowly transformed from wounded confusion into absolute clarity. Charles had spent 40 years assuming I was emotionally dependent on him because I loved him deeply. He never considered that loving someone and understanding them are not the same thing. By the end of the meeting, Rebecca looked almost impressed. "You have more leverage than he realizes," she said, "especially if public financial misconduct becomes relevant." Public. That word lingered in my thoughts all the way home. 2 days later, I hosted what appeared to be an innocent family brunch at the Charleston house. I invited Daniel and Claire, several longtime family friends, Charles's business partner Leonard, and even Patricia from next door. Charles seemed almost relieved by the invitation. I suspect he interpreted it as surrender. Sophia certainly did. She arrived wearing another elegant cream-colored dress while carrying expensive pastries from a bakery downtown as though she were already the lady of the house. Throughout brunch, she moved confidently through my kitchen commenting on possible renovations and discussing neutral paint colors for the guest bedrooms. At one point, I overheard her telling Claire, "The natural light in this house is incredible during late mornings." This house, not even pretending anymore. Charles behaved equally relaxed. He laughed loudly with Leonard over mimosas while discussing future travel plans and business expansion opportunities in Miami. More than once, I caught him watching me carefully, clearly searching for signs of resentment or instability. Instead, I remained gracious. Calm women frighten arrogant men because calmness forces them to underestimate danger. Around noon, while everyone gathered around the dining table finishing dessert, Charles casually announced that he and Sophia would soon be spending more time in Florida. A fresh chapter, he called it proudly while resting one hand over hers. Then came his third and biggest mistake. He looked directly at me and smiled. I appreciate how mature Evelyn has been through all this. It makes the transition easier for everyone. Transition. As though 40 years of marriage could be folded neatly into storage boxes beside winter decorations. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Claire looked physically ill, but I simply lifted my coffee cup calmly and returned his smile. Because sitting beside my plate was a slim leather folder Rebecca prepared the night before, containing copies of every trust restriction, every hidden transfer, every financial disclosure Charles hoped I would never fully understand. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized I was no longer waiting for the right moment to protect myself. I was waiting for the perfect moment to let Charles destroy himself. The moment arrived more quietly than I expected. No dramatic shouting, no shattered glasses, no theatrical confrontation beneath storm clouds like the scenes people imagine when marriages collapse. Real destruction, I learned, often happens in perfectly decorated dining rooms while coffee cools beside untouched dessert plates. Charles was midway through describing waterfront properties in Naples when I finally opened the leather folder beside my plate. The sound alone made him pause. Across the table, Sophia adjusted her posture slightly, her smile tightening for the first time all afternoon. Actually, I said calmly, placing several copies of legal documents onto the tablecloth. Before anyone starts redecorating this house or discussing Florida properties, there are a few details we should probably clarify. Leonard stopped chewing immediately. Claire lowered her eyes toward her lap, while Daniel suddenly looked pale enough to be ill. Charles gave a short, irritated laugh. Evelyn, this is not really the time for paperwork. On the contrary, I replied softly. It is exactly the time. I slid the first document directly toward him. You should start with page 4. His confident expression barely changed at first. Charles had spent decades bluffing through negotiations with judges, investors, and political donors. Men like him believe confidence itself can overpower facts. But then his eyes moved lower across the page and stopped. The room became completely silent except for the ticking grandfather clock near the staircase. What is this? He asked carefully. The Whitmore Residential Trust, I answered. The document you signed 24 years ago without reading because you assumed anything connected to my family inheritance was unimportant. Sophia looked between us uncertainly while Charles continued scanning the paperwork. For the first time since the anniversary party, I saw genuine confusion breaking through his polished composure. This cannot be correct, he muttered. Rebecca's notes were attached clearly beside the highlighted sections. Restrictions on transfer of inherited residential property. Limitations regarding non-bloodline beneficiaries. Financial disclosure obligations involving undisclosed extramarital asset transfers. Every assumption Charles built his future around had begun collapsing line by line across. Legal paper. Leonard quietly removed his reading glasses and leaned forward to examine one of the copies himself. Charles, he said slowly, did you move joint investment funds into external entities connected to your personal relationship? Personal relationship. Such elegant language for betrayal. Sophia finally spoke up, her voice thinner now. I do not understand what any of this means. I looked directly at her for the first time all afternoon. It means the life Charles promised you does not legally belong to him in the way he claimed. Her face lost color immediately. Charles pushed his chair back sharply. This is ridiculous. I have spent 40 years building everything we own. No, I corrected quietly. We spent 40 years building it. You simply convinced yourself my contributions became invisible because I was not standing in courtrooms beside you. Daniel stared at the table while Claire wiped tears silently near the kitchen doorway. My son finally looked up then, but not at me. At his father. Dad, he whispered shakily. Did you seriously never read the trust documents? Charles ignored him completely. He was flipping through pages faster now, his movements becoming less controlled with every paragraph. Then he reached the transfer disclosure section Rebecca specifically prepared for him. I watched the exact moment realization struck. The hidden wire transfers, the condominium, the undeclared financial gifts connected to Sophia, all of it potentially exposed during formal proceedings. "You went behind my back," he said coldly. I almost smiled at the irony. That sentence sounds very different coming from you. Across the table, Sophia slowly removed her hand from Charles's arm. Small movements reveal the truth long before words do. She had entered this house imagining herself the future Mrs. Whitmore standing beside a powerful, wealthy man. Now she sat beside someone whose carefully constructed image was unraveling in front of business associates, family members, and legal documentation. Charles stood abruptly from the table, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. But I remained seated calmly beside my untouched coffee cup while sunlight poured through the dining room windows around us. For weeks, everyone expected me to become the broken older woman abandoned by her husband for someone younger. Instead, sitting there in the home my family protected long before Charles ever entered it, I finally understood something beautiful. He had mistaken my kindness for weakness for 40 years, and that had become the most expensive mistake of his entire life.